Well, thank you everybody for coming to the podcast optimization workshop hosted by TVO. So whether or not you're here to optimize the podcast you're creating, or think about how to optimize a podcast that you might be creating, or just are interested in how to get people to listen to podcasts, this is the place for you. My name is Ariana Longley. I am TVO's digital channel specialist. So basically, I am the in-house YouTuber, I like to call myself. I help optimize our content for different podcasting platforms and YouTube so that people can find what we do and enjoy what we do. But outside of TVO, I am a YouTuber with a YouTube channel where I make video essays exploring pop culture. I have 35,000 subscribers that I've collected organically. So that's just a little bit of context to show sort of my experience with optimization, both in a more corporate environment and an independent environment, which would be similar to what you guys are doing with your own podcasts, if you choose to make one or if you are making one. So I like to look at podcast optimization in 3 different categories. So there's the title, there's the description, and the keyword box. So the little place that you get to put all of your keywords that you research. People don't necessarily get to see, but the algorithm acknowledges. So I'm going to be breaking down our presentation today into these 3 different categories. I did not hurt myself there. So let's start with titles. The first tip I have for optimizing your titles is to keep in mind economy of characters. So how many characters you're using in your title. Most podcasting platforms will let you use 250 characters. However, they will only show the audience when they're browsing through their phone the first 50 characters on Spotify and the first 100 characters on Apple Podcasts. And I call out Spotify and Apple because they're the 2 most popular podcasting platforms. With that, be careful about how you use your space. Make sure that you have the keyword that you want most associated with your episode right at the top of the podcasting title so that people know what it's about. And make sure that you make your full title, the amount that you need people to know about your episode, within that amount of space. Or else, the app will cut you off. So for example, this podcast, what the drop in temp and remote work signals about the that's not actually the title of this podcast. Spotify cut off the last word that started with J and put the ellipses. So now you don't know what the podcast is about because they went over. Now, just because they only show 50 to 100 characters doesn't mean you need to stay within that range. I recommend using as close to the full 250 characters as possible, but keep in mind that past the 100 or past the 50, the rest of it is mainly for the algorithm. So getting the algorithm to know what your podcast is about, putting more keywords in and more identifiers to what you're going to be talking about in your episode. So be careful with space. So before we get into the next tip, I have a game. The Way of Water, Land Before Time, 500 Days of Summer. What do these all have in common? They are great, great, great movie titles. Fantastic movie titles, you would say, but they're terrible podcast titles. Oh my gosh, they're bad. The Land Before Time, I wouldn't know what that movie was about if it wasn't for the poster. And even then, I barely get it. So with that leads us into our next tip. Don't bury the lead. Make sure that people know what your podcast is about immediately. So people are usually listening to podcasts as they're going to go exercise, as they're going to go commute, as they're cleaning their room or whatever they're doing. They're not using their hands and they're not trying to go into their phone. And usually, as they're about to do these things, that's when they're looking at the podcast they're going to be listening to. And they want to know what they're going to be listening to immediately because you have a million other competitors that they could be listening to. So for example, if you have a podcast about water filtration systems in Ontario and you call it The Way of Water, no one's going to know what that's about and they're going to scroll past you to find somebody else. So be sure to communicate the main topic immediately off the bat within that first 50 to 100 characters. And one way of doing this is to tell the news, I like to say. Pretend you're a journalist or you're writing an article and you want to get somebody into your article. Think about it like you're somebody who works at BuzzFeed and you're writing the articles that go at the bottom of every article that get people into that loop. Pretend you're that person. It's a way of getting them in and not being too poetic or cryptic. So the next tip is communicate the value add of your podcast, the unique or special feature of your podcast that can improve or add to your audience's life. To be able to understand what your value add is, ask yourself, how is your podcast going to enrich your viewer and what makes it unique? And then communicate it in your title. And I have 3 suggestions on how you can communicate the value add of your podcast in the title. That's not it. The first is answer a question. Figure out what question your podcast asks and then literally just put that question in the title. Or figure out the answer to a question that your podcast asks and then literally just put that answer in the title. And the reason why is it because A, it's able to show an implication in a inquisitive way. So the implication of your podcast in a way that sparks curiosity. And then B, it just sparks curiosity naturally by having a question. Ooh, what's the answer to that? I wonder what it is. Let's click on your podcast. Curiosity killed the cat, but curiosity also got somebody to listen to your podcast. So use it to your advantage. The next tip I have is communicate emotion, trigger an emotional response. My favorite thing to say is punch them in the heart. The reason why triggering an emotional response is so valuable in getting people to listen to podcasts or getting people to consume content is that once you scratch the itch of an emotion, people want to explore it deeper for the most part. And your podcast, if it's the thing that made them feel something, is going to be the thing that then scratches the itch for them. And 3 ways that you can trigger an emotional response in people is the first one is use powerful words and statements. Love, hate, crush, regret. Because A, that's an emotional thing. It's going to trigger an emotional response. But B, it's going to make, oh, no one's messaging me. And B, it's going to make people wonder why you're using such impactful language. What's so important about what you're talking about that's making you use the word hate? Use impactful language. The second one is address the audience directly. Why you need to listen to this. What are you doing about this? You is the closest thing that you can possibly do to saying their name in the title. It's a conversational thing. It's calling them out. It's like making eye contact. So once you use the word you're relating the podcast and the topic back to their lives directly, and that's going to make them want to listen because they feel there's an implication for something that they're doing. And the next tip is touching on demographic pain points. Now this starts with the podcast topic that you choose. If you choose a topic that relates to what your audience is concerned about or what your audience is thinking about at the moment, and you communicate that in the topic, that's an automatic emotional response just by the nature of what you're talking about. So for example, if you're talking about housing prices in Ontario, that's a hot button issue for Ontario residents. And if your podcast is directed to Ontario residents, that might be something that gets people in and gets people to want to listen. And the next tip for communicating your value add is to communicate urgency. Make people feel they need to listen to this podcast right now, or they're missing out on something, or they're not going to be an informed citizen of the world, or they're not going to get something that everybody else has. Make them feel like this is something that they need to listen to right at that moment. Because, again, they're scrolling through really quickly, and if they're scrolling through really quickly and they feel like they're not going to get another chance to learn this information, they'll click on it. So now that we've gone through some tips on how to optimize your podcast titles, let's go through some examples. So this is a title from a podcast called Face the Nation on the Radio, and the title is Don't Panic. Former CISA director Chris Krebs talks election threats and disinformation. So economy of characters. This is between 50 and 100 characters. Got it? Great. Don't bury the lead. You know exactly what this podcast is going to be talking about. They're going to be talking about this guy, this director of the security agency, talking about election threats and disinformation. Great. Off the bat, clear. And then communicating value add. Election threats and disinformation is a hot button issue right now that affect people and are affecting the world that we all live in. So you got them with the timeliness, and you have them with the pain point. You have don't panic, which doesn't seem like it's saying you, but it's basically an order to the audience. It's it's directly addressing them. Panic is an emotional word. And a little bonus, maybe he's referencing Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. We don't know. That's a quote from it. Why is he doing that? Click on the episode to find out. We're not doing that now. Later. You can do it later. The next one is Bank of Canada increases benchmark rate for the 6th time in bid to cool inflation. Economy of characters, got it. Between 50 and 100. Don't bury the lead. You know exactly what they're going to be talking about. It's very clear. It's a fact, actually. It's not really a title. But that actually makes it a title. Because B, it communicates value add. They've already given value to the audience in this title. You've given them the fact that they need. And if they're going to just scroll along and read it, they feel like they've been enriched already. But now your podcast is going to be the thing that tells them more about it and expands on that thing that is, again, a pain point, a hot button issue, and a fact that is timely and now. And the last one I have is what you need to know about Ontario's new housing legislation. You get economy of characters between 50 and 100. Don't bury the lead. You know exactly what they're going to be talking about. And you don't just know what they're going to be talking about. You know how they're going to be talking about it. They're talking about housing legislation, but they're also giving you probably a list of facts in that is going to be timely, and you're going to have to click on the podcast to know to be an again informed citizen of the world. And then housing legislation, hot button issue, and you. They're directly addressing you. So they're talking to you and they're calling your name and they're looking you in the eye and saying, hey, click here. This is going to give you something valuable. So now we've gone through titles. Let's go to descriptions. How do you write a good description for a podcast that's going to make someone watch it or is going to make the algorithm acknowledge it? So the first tip I have to write your descriptions is don't write a description at all for the first part. Decide your keywords before doing anything. So keywords are basically a list of words and phrases that relate to your podcast that is going to tell the algorithm what your podcast is about. So with YouTube videos, YouTube also has descriptions and titles to tell the algorithm what it's about, but they also have captions. YouTube reads captions that you put in your videos to help them rank the videos. Podcasts don't have that. Podcast apps don't figure out what you're saying. So that's why it's crucial to figure out what words you want associated with your podcast to get the algorithm to notice you. Not only that, this is going to be the thing that grabs people's attention. You want to know what people are looking up first before you go to write anything. So how do you find your list of 50 to 100 words? Well, here are some suggestions. The first one is brainstorm based on the research that you've done for your podcast. So as you're going through and you're looking at articles and you're figuring out how you want to say something or what you're saying, just keep writing down words that keep coming up or that words that remind you of your topic. The next suggestion is borrow terms from other topics, podcasts, articles, YouTube videos, whatever, about what you're going to be talking about. Maybe you didn't think of some of the words that they used, or maybe they're taking a different angle that allowed them to use different vernacular. Borrow from people, because that's going to help you fill out the list of things that are associated with your topic. And the last suggestion is review keywords with a keyword research tool, which I'm going to be talking about a little bit later about what they do. But essentially, with keyword researchers, you punch in roughly the list of words that you've already researched, and then the tool is going to tell you other things that people have typed in addition to your words. So let's say your podcast is about pizza, and you're like pizza, Hawaiian, pepperoni, and then you find out other people are also typing in wood-burning stove. That's something you can throw into your list of keywords. So now that you have your list of keywords, between 50 and 100, let's say, it's really dependent on what your topic is and how in-depth your topic is going to be. How do you really pick what words you want associated with your podcast, what words you want right on the top of your title? And the way we do this is by thinking of keywords in terms of obvious and niche keywords and choosing a combination of the two. So keywords are like umbrellas. You have the more obvious ones that are basically overarching your podcast topic. That's the thing that's going to contextualize your topic in the grander scheme of everything else that's happening. And they're pretty good for, again, contextualizing. So if I was going back to water filtration systems in Ontario, a couple of the words that I would use are water, science, Canada. And those are great, but there's also literally 40 million other podcasts that are using the word water. And those podcasts might not be about water filtration systems. They might be about freezing water. They might be about fish. They might be about why water is good for you. So you're going to get lost in a sea of 40 million other podcasts if you're just using more obvious keyword terms. So what you want to do is pick obvious terms that contextualize and mix it in with the handle of the umbrella, the more niche keywords that are going to support your podcast and hold it up and separate it from the other mess of content out in the world. And niche keywords are ones that do just that. They specify what your topic is. And they're ones that have a high search volume, so between 100,000 to 1 million searches a month, so between 100,000 and 1 million people are looking up your topic. And they have low to medium competition, so not that many people are making videos about them. So be sure to combine more obvious keywords with niche keywords. Now, how do you figure out what's an obvious and a niche keyword? Well, the keyword research tool I was talking about. So this is an example of a keyword research tool. This is what they would show you, and this is the Google Keyword Researcher. And on the first column, it's the keyword. The second one is average monthly searches. These two don't matter, but I show you because they're what's in between competition, just so you have an idea of what the layout is. This is an example of a niche keyword and an obvious keyword. So the first one, dug forward, would be a good niche keyword to separate your podcast. And the reason why is if you look at the average monthly searches, there's between 100K and 1 million people are looking up dug forward on Google in a month. And the competition, if you look over in this category, is low. So not that many people are making videos about Doug Ford, relatively. So he would be a good niche keyword. Mental health plan, on the other hand, might not be a good niche keyword, but it might be a good obvious keyword. So mental health plan has between 10 and 100 searches a month on Google. So not that many people are looking at mental health plan. But if you look at competition, a lot of people are making videos about it. So that might be a good way to put your podcast in the grander umbrella, but not a good way to separate themselves because nobody's looking it up, but everyone's making videos about that. So you have your list of words. What do you do now? You can finally start to type things. So the first sentence of the allotted 4,000 characters you're allowed is the most important thing for both getting your audience and getting the algorithm. So the first sentence should have the repeated main keyword that you put in your title right at the top. You should naturally fit it in, but it should be right at the top. And the reason why is that the algorithm acknowledges that you've repeated that keyword. It means it's really important. So if someone's going to look up that word, you're more likely to show up because you've identified, hey, this is really important. I'm using this multiple times. The next thing you should do is for the audience, for people reading it. But the first sentence should be able to contextualize what the title said. So it should expand on it, and this gives you a second chance to hook people in and give them more information about what the podcast is going to be about. Granted, they can go into the actual podcast page, the episode page, click on it, and read the full description, but you need to be able to hook them within the first sentence because not everybody does that. They usually pick what they want to listen to based off the title and that first 120 characters. So you have to write 120 characters for the algorithm and for the audience to get them, but what do you do after that? Well, you then have to write between 200 and 300 words for your description. That is the optimal amount of words to make a description so that you can put as many keywords in as possible. And repeat keywords. The main keywords you feel are important to your podcast, repeat them in the 200 to 300 words. That doesn't sound like a lot, but it is. 200 to 300 words is essentially a mini article, and it's sometimes really hard to fill that out. And I see a lot of podcasts on every different podcasting, just person who makes podcasts in every podcasting app. People like to fill out the 200 and 300 words with filler words, like this week, in this episode today. The reason why we shouldn't do that and we shouldn't include filler words is because filler words do nothing to tell the algorithm what your podcast is about. It's just taking up valuable space that you could be using to put actual things that help the algorithm know what your podcast is about and to help the audience know what your podcast is about. So instead of using filler words or filler terms, use more descriptive language. So for example, in this episode, maybe instead of saying in this episode, you say, in this hour-long discussion on water filtration systems in Ontario. Make it descriptive. Don't say water filtration systems in Ontario unless that's what the podcast is about. But I love that example, apparently. So how do you then use your 200 to 300 words? Because like I said, it's a lot, and you can't use this week. Here's some suggestions. The first one is add questions your podcast answers and the implications of your podcast. So figure out just a list of questions that you answer. You might not even directly try to answer them. It could just be like the question version of something that you're saying in your podcast. But the benefit of this is that you're able to naturally put keywords in and naturally put things that you're saying into the description of your podcast. The next one is add background information that adds context. This background information might not even be in your podcast episode. You might not talk about it. It might not be relevant at all. It's just background. The reason why is because it allows you to naturally include information and naturally include keywords into your podcast description. And also, it's just like a fun little extra Easter egg for anyone reading it. It's a fun experience. And just keep in mind that when you're writing your podcast, natural is the thing, or podcast description, natural is the key term here. Be natural, because if you just start stuffing keywords in randomly, the algorithm is going to notice the fact that you just started putting keywords in, and they're going to think that you're trying to spam the system, and they're not going to recommend you. And the last tip is highlight your unique take. What is your podcast doing that no other podcast is doing that topic? Are you taking an intersectional lens on the thing, or on the topic? Are you doing an interview? Are you doing an in-depth discussion? Are you who are you catering to? Who's your demographic? All of these help identify who your podcast is for, and then again allow you to naturally include keywords into it, the description. So you have all this information, that's all well and good, you know how to do it, but then you get to your computer and there's a blank screen and your mind's gone nowhere and you get nothing. It's hard. It's hard writing 200 to 300 words just based on a list of random words. A good suggestion on how to figure out how to combine the random words that you've found out about your podcast is use a robot. We're in the future. We have hoverboards. We have polyester clothes now. It's great. We have robots that will write descriptions for you. So what I like to do is use an artificial intelligence description writer that allows me to type in all of my keywords that I researched, and it allows me to type in my demographic that I'm looking at, and it'll create a paragraph description. Don't use that paragraph. That's a terrible paragraph. It's inaccurate. It doesn't say anything about your podcast because it doesn't know what your podcast is about, and it's plagiarism, really. The reason I'm suggesting using an AI description writer is because it allows you to see how you can include those podcast terms together, how you can naturally being the key word, put them into a coherent paragraph. And it just gives you not a blank page, which is the worst thing in the world. And this is really helpful. I'm going to give you an example of what this sort of machine does and how it would work. So for this podcast description writer, I typed in the video title, what do strong mayors mean for democracy? I typed in the target audience, Ontario, Canada residents, and here's the list of keyword terms that I had for my podcasting description, and it made this nice little paragraph. That's not what the podcast is about, but it's a nice little paragraph that I had as a reference to start pulling not sentences, but like how they arrange the words and how they put them together. And you can tell it's inaccurate because the first sentence is in this video, which is a podcast, Doug Ford discusses how he would like to see the mayor's powers strengthened in order to better manage the city. Doug Ford wasn't on this actual podcast that we're using as a case study, but again, it was a good tool to sort of have as a jumping off point. So let's look at a case study of an actual TVO podcast and how we can optimize the description and the title. And this is from our podcast On Poly, which is a great podcast that looks at Ontario politics and current affairs weekly. Highly recommend everyone check it out. So we're going to go through how to optimize the description and the title just a little bit more effectively. So the first title is When Democracy Might Not Mean Another Majority Rule. It's a good title. It has democracy in there. It has an implication, and it gives you it gives you the information about what they're going to be talking about. But the new title I have, What Do Stronger Mayors Mean for Democracy, just streamlines it a little bit more. It makes it a question, so it gives you something to hook onto, and it puts democracy into question. So it gives you a bit of an implication. What's going to happen? What are we talking about? How does it relate to your life? So let's go on to the description. So this is the older title, and this is the description. The title being When Democracy Might Not Mean Another Majority Rule. Ontario avoids another education strike as the province and CUPE come to a tentative agreement. This is a good first sentence. The one issue with it is that it doesn't relate to the title. So that doesn't contextualize what the title is telling the audience what the podcast is about. A new bill looks to empower certain municipal leaders to the point where majority rule does not always apply to their proposed bylaws, and the right of residents not to be separated from their spouses in long-term care is one step closer to reality. MPP Catherine Fife joins her co-host Steve Paikin and John Michael McGrath to discuss her private member's bill To Death Do Us Part. All of the bolded words are keywords. Again, a good description. It tells you what it's going to be about. It uses ample number of keywords, and it's separated into sections so the information is easily communicated. This is how I took the tools that I gave you before to just pump it up a little bit and make it a little bit more effective. So as you can see, I stretched it out. I used a lot more keywords. The first sentence is now, Doug Ford proposed a new bill to grant stronger mayoral powers to municipal leaders, allowing them to shirk majority rule when passing bylaws. So it's just a longer sentence, and then it directly relates to what the title is about. It kind of gives you context for why we're asking the question. When will this new bill pass, and what does it mean for democracy? That's a question that we answer in the podcast. It gives you a fact that we're going to give you information on, but also a more philosophical question that we're going to be discussing. Then Ontario schools avoid another education support worker strike as the province and CUPE come to a tentative agreement. That's the same. Then elderly residents' rights not to be separated from their spouses in long-term care facilities is one step closer to reality. Catherine Fife joins co-hosts Steve and John to discuss her private member's bill that would provide choice and dignity to Ontarians in retirement homes and nursing homes. So what I did here is I added just a tag at the end. So again, give more context and more emotion. I showed, why does this matter? Why is this important? I gave context. So the last suggestion I have is to add a boilerplate end section to the end of your podcasts. So every podcast should have a unique 200 to 300 description. Every single episode should have their own unique little blurb that I told you how to write. This is independent of that. This is its own separate thing. A boilerplate end section with links to other products and platforms that you have gives audiences a chance to engage with you outside of your podcast. It gets them to know who you are outside of that one episode they listen to. And the benefit of that is that they are then consuming you on their own time. They're learning about who you are and they're finding a connection with you. And once they feel connected with you and your brand and who you are, they're more likely to come back to you. You don't have to convince them. You don't have to try to find them through the algorithm. They're going to naturally do that so that they can listen to you. You have a loyal fan. So this is TVO's boilerplate end section that we put at the end of our podcasts. It has a link to our website, to our social media channels, to subscribe to our newsletter, and to our apps. However, you can put whatever you want. You can put your social media accounts. You can put very specific pieces of writing you have, your portfolios, anything. Highly recommend. It's a great idea. So now let's move on to keywords. So not the keywords I was talking about before that you put in your titles and your descriptions, but the keyword box. So when you're going to submit your podcast on most major podcasting platforms, they ask you to put in a bunch of tags in the metadata that audiences will not see, but it's for the algorithm. So the algorithm knows where to place you. So the tip I have for how to fill that out and how to optimize it is put up into the character limit every word that you found important to your podcast. What's the most important terms? And specifically, what words do you use in the title, the first sentence in the description, and most often through the rest of your description? And the reason why is that if the algorithm notices that you're repeating keywords, they're recognizing the fact that, like, hey, this is important. If you're doing a video on, or if you're doing a podcast on My Neighbor Totoro, the movie, and you put it in the title and the description 3 times, and then the keywords, they're like, oh, they're actually talking about this. They're not trying to trick me into thinking that we're talking about this. Let's start pumping it out to people who are looking for My Neighbor Totoro in podcast form. Maybe someone is. And then the last tip I have for optimizing the keyword box, the hidden metadata box, is to be consistent. Be like Bill Murray in Groundhog Day. Be the same in every podcast. So every overarching podcast series has a brand identity. There are specific words that relate to every podcast. Again, series, not individual episodes. You can use specific keywords that are associated with your podcast series in every single one of your hidden metadata boxes to communicate to the algorithm, hey, all of my podcasts are about this. Like, I'm not just as a series about this. Everything I talk about and every piece of content I make is actually about Groundhog Day. Let's say you have a podcast about Groundhog Day, a full series about Groundhog Day. So by putting the individual brands, the words that associate with your brand in every podcast, hidden metadata description box, you are leveraging your core series value and your brand identity in search. And an example of this, one of our podcasts on Poly. Again, highly recommend you listen to it. It's really good. These are a bunch of keywords that I've came up with that relate to our core brand identity that we can use at the end of every single metadata box that is hidden from the audience, but the algorithm acknowledges. So all of these words could be used, brainstorm your own, and then insert them into the keyword box. Now, don't limit the amount of unique keywords that you use for every episode, just because you need to put in the 10 that you've come up with for your whole series identity. But like, if you have space, use every piece of space you have in that box. You have the ability to use the whole technological cow, I like to say. And with that, that is the end of the presentation.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.